delighted to welcome all of you this morning and welcome you to Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series. I'm Rabbi Susan Shankman, as many of you know, and I'm looking forward to this morning's presentation. But before we get into introductions and into the program itself, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the events of yesterday. Shabbat is traditionally a day of peace. It's a day of rest and rejuvenation. It's a day of reflection, and certainly we know that any of us who were witnessing and watching the news and know that what happened in Colleyville, Texas, at Congregation Beth Israel was the complete opposite of what Shabbat is supposed to be. It became a day of fear. And a day of potential and ended with some violence as well. And I wanted to take a moment to both acknowledge that, and for us, I'll share on behalf of all of us a prayer, a blessing on behalf of the congregation, Beth Israel, and also my colleague and friend, Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker. The menchiest mensch you will ever meet, and as you know, as many of us know, if you've seen even the articles already that are coming out about how calm and collected he was through this whole situation, we know that our houses of worship of any religion should be places of peace, places of gathering, places of community. And yesterday, that image was threatened, and today we have the opportunity to move forward and to continue building a world of peace and community. And so I'm going to offer this prayer. This is the traditional prayer, which is known as the Birkat HaGomel, which is a prayer that marks an escape from peril, whether an illness or, in this case, a dangerous situation, a life-threatening situation. And so I offer this on behalf of Rabbi Citron Walker and also all those in his community. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hagomel lechayavim tovot, shegamalani gamalanu kol tov. Our thanks to you, bountiful one, Adonai our God, sovereign of the universe, who in your inscrutable way watches over the worthy and the wayward, for having graciously done for that community in Beth Israel and Colleyville, Texas, abundant kindness by shielding them from great harm. May God, who spared them, continue to grant them and to continue to grant all of us all that is good. Oseh shalom b'mramav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru. Amen. May the one who brings peace and creates peace in the world bring peace to us, to all Israel, to all who dwell on the earth. And we all say together, Amen. So as Dr. Berger and I were speaking this morning at the beginning, today seems appropriate to come together. We already obviously had this plan, but because we know that there is work to be done and action that is, especially as we observe the anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday this weekend, we know the importance of speaking up, of being engaged in our community, of reaching across lines of difference and creating bridges and working together. So I'm delighted to bring you this morning's presentation, which we bring you in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. And as is our usual format, we will have a chance to hear from our author, and then we'll engage in a Q&A session. So I invite you to, during the time that Dr. Berger is speaking, if you would like to send a question directly to me through the chat that I can ask later on. We also encourage you, as we do for all of our programs with the Jewish Book Council, we encourage you to purchase a copy of her book. I'm going to put the link in the chat. I will tell you it may take a little longer during COVID. The access, and she can speak to this, will maybe a little bit more challenging, but certainly well worth it. LaNitra M Berger is the Senior Director of the Office of Fellowships in the Office of Undergraduate Education and Associate Director of the African American Studies Program at George Mason University. In this role, inclusive excellence and social justice principles have informed her work since she took the position in 2010. As an international educator, she's worked to help underrepresented students gain access to transformational educational opportunities with a focus on study abroad. Since coming to Mason, LaNitra has helped secure prestigious national scholarships and fellowships, such as the Boren, Fulbright, Truman, Goldwater, and Critical Language Scholarship, many of whom are first-generation, low-income, or minority students. She has helped students secure more than $2 million in external funding through scholarships and fellowships. In 2018, she became the diversity coordinator for the Fulbright program in a consulting role with IIE to strengthen the program's outreach, support, and alumni engagement initiatives. LaNitra has received the Spirit of King Award and the Margaret C. Howell Award for her work at Mason to diversify education abroad and fellowships. She serves on several nonprofit boards, including as president and chair of the board of NAFSA, Association of International Educators, the Poses Jewish Community Center of Northern Virginia, the AIFS Academic Advisory Board, and Globalized DC. LaNitra's scholarly interests in art and social activism in the African and Jewish diaspora, LaNitra's scholarly interests are in art and social activism in the African and Jewish diasporas. She received her MA and PhD in art history from Duke University and a bachelor's degree in art history and international relations from Stanford University. She is the author of 2 books, Exploring Education Abroad, a guide for racial and ethnic minority participants, and the monograph Irma Stern and her racial paradox of South African modern art, Audacities of Color, which obviously we're familiar with and we'll be speaking about today. She is also the editor of Social Justice and International Education, Research, Practice, and Perspectives. LaNitra is originally from San Bernardino, California, so she's anticipating our weather event, whatever that's going to be today, with a little bit of trepidation. And one of the most special aspects of LaNitra's family practice and personal practice is their Shabbat observance each Friday night. I know with her 2 boys that's a time of gathering and connection, and we are so blessed to be able to have you with us this morning, and certainly to have you as a part of our community. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But LaNitra Berger, thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Sue, for the wonderful introduction and for the invitation to speak to your congregation today. I've been really looking forward to this opportunity for a very long time. And I think that the situation that happened yesterday and the fact that we are celebrating the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. this weekend is a really important time for us to come together and think about the values that Dr. Martin Luther King promoted and supported, and to really think about what kinds of things that we as individuals can do to promote peace, understanding, and mutual support for one another. So I really appreciate the invitation today. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank everyone who came today. I know it's a snowy day. I want to thank the Jewish Book Council for allowing me to do a second year of a book tour and to be able to speak to so many different audiences throughout the country about this book. And, I also want to thank my husband and my 2 boys, Nathan and Luke, who hopefully will stay upstairs and not Zoom bomb this talk. But my husband's really chased me all around the world as I've done research for this project. Every couple of months, I'd say, I'm off to South Africa, I'm off to Germany, I'm off to this other place. And he never thought twice. He would get his passport ready and go along with me. So this has been as much of a journey of our relationship as it has been the research for the book. I also want to thank my wonderful friends and colleagues at the Poses JCC who have really been the source of the book's transition from a dissertation to book manuscript. I've given presentations about Irma Stern at the Poses JCC and their Adult Learning Institute for many years. And they really encouraged me to keep going and press forward when it seemed like it was very difficult to finish this book. And I tested a lot of the ideas out on them. And I really feel like this is a collaboration as much as it is a monograph of sorts. And then finally, I want to thank someone who's really been supportive of interfaith collaboration over the last year or so, and that's Mlk, who is a well-known member of the Jewish community in the DC area, but has been particularly supportive of my work in African American studies and making connections with the Jewish community at George Mason University. And so without Alan's support, we wouldn't be able to do some of the work that we're doing now, connecting with Mason Hillel and building relationships between Black and Jewish students on George Mason's campus. And so I really appreciate that. I also appreciate Rabbi Sue's blessing at the beginning of this talk today. And I also want to acknowledge the horrific situation with Beth Israel Synagogue in Colleyville, Texas. There are too many times, as I was telling her earlier, where I've given a talk the day after some kind of attack on a synagogue or other house of worship. And I think that this is an epidemic in itself. And something that unfortunately Black and Jewish communities are all too familiar with, the idea that you cannot worship freely and that your religious sanctuaries become sites of violence. And so I also am thankful that all of the hostages are safe. So I give lectures all the time about Irma Stern, but this one's different for the reasons that we just spoke about, but also because this is a special weekend where we pause and we think about the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And you know, Irma Stern is a Jewish South African artist from another time period and a place that's very far away. But I think that a lot of what I talk about in my book, and also what I've researched and thought through as I've taught in South Africa and interacted with South Africans and specifically the Jewish community in South Africa, gives us some important things to think about this weekend in particular, as we are looking at the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. I want to draw your attention, most importantly, to the idea of allyship and the ways in which Black and Jewish communities have come together historically around issues of racism and anti-Semitism, and how that alliance has really helped us to tackle some of the nation's most vexing problems. And what I've noticed as a researcher is that this is not an uncommon relationship. I saw it in South Africa. I see it in various time periods here in the United States. It happens in other parts of the world as well. And I think that there's a lot that we've done together. And even though in the last year to year and a half, there's been some friction between the two communities over various issues, we have much more in common than not. And I think that it's important for us to think about that and remember how we can find ways to work together. So as Rabbi Sue said, I live in an interfaith household myself. I'm African-American. My parents escaped to California from the segregated South in the 1960s. My husband is Jewish. His parents escaped Poland in the 1960s and came to the United States. And somehow we met at Stanford University in college, and we've been together ever since. And we now have two boys that are young. They're 5 and almost 10, and we're raising them as best as we can in an interfaith context. They go to Jewish schools, but we also take them to church on Sundays. And so we're always talking about issues of racial injustice, of social justice, of poverty and inequality. I bring my boys and my family with me when I go to do research in South Africa or when I teach. So they've really seen a lot of the world that I didn't get to see as a young person. And you know, it's really interesting and enlightening to see the world through those young kids' lives. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not all serious at our dinner table. There's a lot of potty jokes. There's a lot of talking about sports and superheroes as well. So, you know, I don't want you to think that we're super pedantic or anything like that, but it is really important for us that our children understand these values early. So on Friday, we listened to the Mlk Shabbat Service at Washington Hebrew Congregation, and I was thrilled to see that the First Baptist Church of Glenarden's choir was part of it, and the outstanding talk that Angela also Brooks gave. I've worked in the past with Pastor Jenkins, and in fact, he had invited a group, an interfaith group of Black and Jewish people to his church service last month. So this is something that I live out every day, something that I study academically, something that I believe in. And, you know, I think that this very long-standing relationship is deeply rooted in shared values and concerns and also hope. So we can't really move forward as two communities without constant tending and nurturing and with the expectation of friction in this relationship in order for it to grow and strengthen. So with that, I'm going to take you in a time machine back to South Africa in the 20th century and help you understand this particular artist that I've studied for essentially my entire adult life. I don't pretend to have all the answers about Irma Stern. I'm merely presenting you the story and the life of this extraordinary woman from my perspective. And I really appreciate the discussions that I've had through the Jewish Book Council talks, because every talk has ended differently. People have different questions. People see different things in her work and in her story. And I think that's really the value of giving these presentations. I started this project in 1999. I was not intending on doing research on someone like Irma Stern. I wanted to go back to France and live there. And I was in the library, and an auction catalog fell on the floor, opened up, and there was a page with an Irma Stern painting on it. And the painting was so incredibly captivating that I wanted to know who the artist was. And that's how the project started. I started tracing back her history and realized that it was not a traditional, she was not a traditional type of artist with a traditional type of background. And women artists are highly underrepresented in the art historical canon. And so my dissertation advisor said, you know, you got to go for this. I did not speak any German. I had to start learning German from scratch. And, you know, the project took off from there. So for me, though, what I was interested in when I got to Cape Town in 2004, after having done a year's worth of research in Berlin, was what happened in Stern's case when Black and Jewish communities intersected. So Irma Stern is a Jewish South African artist. Her parents were of German descent. And she was deeply embedded in the Jewish community, even though that community was also extremely diverse in its viewpoints and its origins. She was a very strong part of that community. And yet at the same time, she herself had views that were very divergent from the Jewish community views. And her legacy reflects that. So the book title is, you know, Irma Stern and the Racial Paradox of South African Modern Art. And I'm talking about two paradoxes in this book. The first of which is how someone like Stern, an artist like Stern, could be so interested in Black subjects, while at the same time not respecting Black people as fully human, fully worthy of equal rights. I see that that's one of the central paradoxes that we see throughout modern art in terms of how Black people are depicted on canvas versus how they're treated. But there's actually a second paradox, a second racial paradox that I'm talking about as well. And that was the issue of how the South African Jewish community dealt with its own whiteness during apartheid. The community really struggled with apartheid as it evolved. And part of that struggle was that they were not considered to be white initially. And in order to create a larger white population, the apartheid government eventually started to consider them white. And how did they navigate both trying to stand up against racism, but also negotiating this very fluid and shifting white identity? So I talk about that in the book as well. I'm going to share my screen now so I can start showing you some images. Okay, looks like everybody can see that. So who was Irma Stern? The photo on my left is a picture of Irma Stern as a young woman. She was a person who, from the beginning of her life, was surrounded by people who were different than her. And I think that is important when I think about who she eventually became and why it's so vexing to think about how she responded to the social events that occurred during her life. She was born in 1894 and died in 1966. So when you think about those two dates and what she lived through most of the most significant social and political events of the 20th century. And in some way, shape, or form, she was deeply influenced and affected by those events. So I love this picture of Irma Stern. This is her as a baby, because not only is she on a pedestal, which also is indicative of how she ended up posthumously after she died, but also she was surrounded by people who were different from her from the beginning. This is a picture of her with a governess. And, you know, she, unlike many of the white male European artists who were her contemporaries, was around so many people who were different than her from the time she was a baby. I put a map of South Africa up just so that people can be oriented geographically as well. Stern was born in the Transvaal region, which is in the northeastern section of the country. But she lived in Cape Town, which is on the coast in the southwestern part of the country. And there's about 700 miles between Johannesburg and Cape Town. It's about an hour flight now. It could be a day-long drive, if not longer, if you were to drive it. And when you think about it during Stern's time, it would take even longer. There weren't as many roads and ways to get to and from. So that's just within South Africa. I'm going to tell you about how Stern literally traveled the world from a very young age as well. But I wanted to give you that orientation. So she was born in 1894. She was born in a rural part of South Africa. Her parents immigrated to South Africa from Germany. Her father owned a general store. This was during the time when mining and gold and diamonds and minerals were discovered. So there was a gold rush to that region. And so he provided support through his general store. But then the Boer War broke out, the war between the Afrikaners and the British. And her father was taken prisoner. Her family became refugees and they were sent to Cape Town. And they stayed there for a little while, but then there was a disease outbreak. And to get away from the disease outbreak, they decided to go back to Germany. So back then, the only way to do that was to take a boat. So they got on a boat and they went back to Germany. And that's where her family stayed for quite a while. Her family came from money in Germany. And so they returned to a relatively well-off lifestyle. They lived in Berlin on the Kurfürstendamm, or the Kudamm, as people call it there. Her family took her to the opera. They went to plays. And she kept a diary where she recorded all the different things that she was able to do as a young person in Berlin. In 1913, she enrolled in an art class at the Weimar Academy and studied with some very prominent artists at that time. And then World War I broke out and the family had to stay in Germany throughout the war. And Stern witnessed soldiers returning from war in Germany and started to really process as a young woman what the aftermath of war would look like. And after taking some art classes, she painted this painting called The Eternal Child in 1916. And she credits this painting as the first time that she understood how to use art to think through and address social subjects. So she says that she saw this young girl riding on a tram who looked very despondent, and she attributed that to just the general mood of the country after, during the war. And so she did this painting and really started to look at these societal issues through the lens of her art. So one of her family friends, who are also all very well connected, introduced her to someone who would become very influential and a mentor in her life. And that was an artist named Max Pechstein. And Pechstein was a German expressionist artist. He was very well established by the time he met Stern. He was part of an early group of expressionists who were part of a group called Die Brücke. And they were also pioneers in both technique, but also in looking at social issues through their artwork. And Pechstein was very interested in African sculpture. He had never been to Africa, but he had seen African sculpture in ethnographic museums. So he was very interested in non-Western art. He was connected to a gallery, and this gallery was able to pay for him to go to Palau, which was a German colony at the time. And so he went to Palau with his wife. They lived there. He painted lots of paintings in Palau, but that really shaped his meeting with Stern, because he had been attuned and interested in non-Western subjects. And he met Stern, who was South African. She was German speaking, but she was South African. And so this got him closer to people who were really connected to people in Africa. So they started a correspondence. Pechstein started to mentor her. The correspondence lasted both, his entire lifetime. And he encouraged her to keep remaining interested in South Africa and remaining interested in Black subjects in particular. And this was a formative time in his career, but also for her as a young woman. The most important thing that Pechstein did for her was introduce her to his art dealer, Wolfgang Gerlit. Wolfgang Gerlit came from a very prominent art family in Germany, and he had a gallery called the Gallery Fritz Gerlit. And this gallery was known as one of the most famous modern art galleries in Berlin. And Gerlit was interested in supporting artists who were doing things that were cutting edge, in particular artists who were interested in painting subjects from outside of Europe. And so not only did he support Pechstein in his trip to Palau, but he then started to work with Irma Stern. And she would work with the Gerlit family for many years after that. So Gerlit actually commissioned Stern to do a series of lithographs herself called Dume la Morena. And you see the cover image here on my left from 1920. And I have these other two images up here as well, so you can get a sense of what Stern is painting for South African audiences, or the one in the middle is from 1925, and the other one was also painted in the 1920s, and a sense of what her German paintings look like, which she's painting and creating work for a German audience. As I mentioned, South Africa is extremely diverse. So she's encountering people who are Indian, Black people, Chinese people, all kinds of diverse people in South Africa. And I see there's some stylistic differences in the way that she's portraying Blackness for a German audience through Dume la Morena versus what she's painting, in a South African context. So Stern stayed there through the war. In 1920, she decided she wanted to go back to South Africa and establish herself as a South African artist. And that was significant for a young woman. She was unmarried. She was still living with her parents. And women just were not seen as having artistic potential. So that was very risky for her to move back and set up her own practice. She got back to Cape Town in 1920 and realized that it was not Berlin. It was very boring. The sidewalks rolled up at 6 o'clock. She at one point described Cape Town as like a, quote, soda water that had lost its fizz, end quote. So her life in Cape Town was very different than it was in Berlin. But she established herself. She set up an art practice, and she was able to connect with members of the Jewish community and also with local galleries to start showing her work. The initial response was tepid. People were very confused as to why someone with artistic talent would paint Black people in the ways that she was painting them on the canvas. And that means not as caricatures, not as incidentals to the landscape, that they were foregrounded in many ways. And so she struggled to gain traction for this type of work initially when she got to Cape Town. She painted lots of other things, many other subjects, so still lives and landscapes and other things like that. And those were also done in a modern expressionist style. But her paintings of Black people were very perplexing to the Cape Town audience. One thing I found interesting in my research that I really chose to emphasize in my book and in my talks is that there was a global conversation about Black identity and Black representation going on at this time. And it just so happened that Berlin was the place that this was happening. So Stern was in Berlin at this time, working with German expressionists, but there are also lots of African-American thinkers and scholars who are in Berlin at the same time, looking at the same artists, going to the same galleries and cafes. And so Stern crossed paths with Alain Locke, who we know here in the United States as one of the foremost thinkers of the Harlem Renaissance and modernism in the United States. And so somehow Alain Locke crossed paths with Stern. I believe that he probably attended one of her gallery shows or heard of her through another artist, but he was very intrigued by German artist representations of Blackness. And this was incorporated into his own work and thinking here in the United States. So for Locke, he was really interested in how he can encourage Black artists in the United States to take the same care and attention to the Black form and the Black image as he saw these German expressionists doing in Berlin. And so he wrote about this prolifically. There's a portrait of Locke by Winold Reiss, who is a German artist who also did many of the illustrations for his seminal book, The New Negro, which is considered to be the Bible of the Harlem Renaissance. Locke was very interested in that German connection. And he, in many ways, felt that Europeans were ahead of African Americans because they had already recognized the importance of Africa and African art in the work. So the reason why this is interesting is because he actually wrote about Irma Stern. He misspelled her name, but he wrote about Irma Stern in The New Negro. He was mentioning some artists that he felt should be serving as models to Black American artists at the time. And this is around 1925. And he wrote about Stern. He said, quote, "There's a vital connection between this new artistic respect for African idiom and the natural ambition of Negro artists for a racial idiom in their own art expression." Then he goes on to mention European artists who he says have engaged in, quote, "sustained and lifelong study of the subject of painting of the particularly difficult values of the Negro subject." And then he names Max Pechstein and then Elaine Stern, as well as a few other German painters. And he makes two mentions of her in The New Negro. And I think that that's a really important way to make that link between what Stern was doing in South Africa and Germany and what was going on here in the United States. There was a global connection before email, before the internet, even before really airline travel, that these artists were still connected in this broader transatlantic dialogue. So as I mentioned, Stern came back. She was in Cape Town in 1920, and the community that supported her the most was the Jewish community. Cape Town was and still is very much a segregated place. So it was segregated by race, it was segregated by language. People who were Afrikaner speaking oftentimes did not interact with people who were English speaking. The Jewish community tended to be very close knit. And so she came back and she made some great friends who really supported her for the rest of her career. And I'm going to talk about some of these friends here because she also painted them. As I mentioned, the Jewish community in South Africa, and I'm sure that some people on this call today are either from South Africa or have connections to South Africa, extremely diverse, several waves of immigration from different countries, lots of people escaping pogroms in Eastern Europe to come to South Africa. So the South African Jewish community is not at all homogenous. There are people of Ashkenazi and Sephardic descent, lots of people who were Yiddish speaking, as I mentioned, who came from Eastern Europe, and very different political views and perspectives. And so the two friends that you see here, Rosa van Gelderen and Hilda Prowitzky, were two of Stern's very best friends. They happened to also be lesbian lovers and lifelong partners. And they were educators. They did all kinds of things. They wrote art criticism. They ran a school for colored girls. And when I say colored in this context, I'm talking about mixed race South Africans. And most importantly, they were just really strong members of the community. And so these two women in particular supported Stern because they saw her artistic potential. And Hilda Prowitzky in particular was known for her art criticism. And she had some really interesting ideas that she wrote about in Jewish publications. She saw what was going on in terms of some of the growing racial tensions and issues in South Africa. She saw the growing inequality. And she started to ask the question of what is the role of a Jewish artist in a time like this? Is the role of a Jewish artist only to paint Jewish subjects, like life cycle events or people from the community? Or is the role of the Jewish artist to paint the issues of the day, to raise the issues that are bothering the community and to bring that into discussion through art? And she felt that Stern was someone who, in painting Black women, was bringing that discussion into the Jewish community. And so she really encouraged Stern to keep doing the work that she was doing. Rosa van Gelderen, her family was of Sephardic heritage. They had come from Holland to South Africa. And she also was extremely supportive of Stern, even though she apparently never liked this portrait. She hid it because she felt that it didn't portray her in the light that she wanted. But they were both lifelong friends of Stern. And then Stern had two other friends named Richard and Frida Feldman. So Hilda and Rosa lived in Cape Town. Richard and Frida Feldman lived in Johannesburg. And those two areas, just in terms of their Jewish communities and in terms of their politics, are very, very different places. And so Richard Feldman, his family immigrated from Russia in the early 20th century. He grew up in a very Yiddish-speaking environment and really embraced left-wing politics. And he and Stern became fast friends, even though they politically were on different sides of the spectrum. And Stern would often stay with them when she came to Johannesburg. She would spend a lot of time with Frida Feldman. As you can see, she painted Frida, she painted Richard. But Richard was also thinking about this question as well. So Richard was involved in art criticism and writing in Johannesburg, and really involved in writing in the Yiddish-speaking community. And so much so that Richard was also a local politician. And because he was in Johannesburg, which is a mining, it started as a mining town, he noticed the social inequality that was arising out of the dangerous conditions in the mines, that Black men were dying every day by falling in these shafts and being underpaid or not even paid at all in some cases. And he actually wrote a book in Yiddish called Black and White, which was a collection of stories that addressed the issues that were going on in the mining culture in Johannesburg. And he used one of Stern's paintings, as you can see here, to illustrate that book. And so that really, shows how Stern's was embedded in the Jewish community, how her work was being used and considered as many members of the Jewish community were trying to understand the racial dynamics that were going on in South Africa. At the same time, the community itself, because many people had come escaping racial persecution and violence in other parts of the world, didn't want to draw a lot of attention to itself. And so there was a tension between, how much should we speak out when we see something that's wrong versus at what point will we be drawing attention to ourselves? And, many, the Afrikaner government, the Afrikaner politicians were anti-Semitic. So they did not want to increase the Jewish population initially, and the community had serious concerns that were warranted based on the anti-Semitism that they were experiencing. So there was a lot that they were trying to think about, and Stern's work helped them, gave them a vehicle for having this discussion. I want to draw attention to another Stern painting that I think is really interesting, and she's painted this woman who is known as one of South Africa's most famous novelists. And there are lots of women in South Africa who gained prominence in the 20th century, which is different than a lot of other places. So Sarah Gertrude Millen was also a Jewish South African who wrote several novels. God's Stepchildren is one that many people are familiar with. And Stern did this portrait of her in 1941. And Millen was known not only for her novels, but also because she had very conservative views. She wrote a lot about issues of race and miscegenation that got the attention of very right-wing thinkers here in the United States. So even though Stern was part of this Jewish community that was really pushing to talk about race, to talk about class, to talk about inequality, there was also a very conservative contingent of people who were not as interested in thinking about equality as much as, maybe some of these ideas of racial segregation are warranted. And that includes Stern. As she became older, she also became very rigid in her views. In the 1930s, she had been traveling back and forth between Europe and South Africa by boat to exhibit in Europe. She gained a lot of popularity in Europe. She was exhibiting in all kinds of European cities. But at the same time, her views on race became even more entrenched towards what was becoming the status quo, which was segregation. And in fact, she actually went to Senegal in the late 1930s and was very upset when she saw that in Senegal, they did not have segregated bathrooms and facilities. And she said that was, to her, that was extremely problematic, that segregation was not in place in an area where there are lots of African people. So even as she was expanding her mind by traveling, expanding her mind by being around people who look different than her, her own ideas started to become much narrower in terms of what she thought was appropriate for interracial contact. So in 1933, Stern saw what was going on in Germany and decided it was no longer safe for her to continue traveling to Europe and specifically to Germany. So she started to stay closer to home as things were unfolding in Europe. And as she was doing that, she spent more time in South Africa, more time traveling within South Africa. But as World War II began, it was very unsafe for her to travel at all by boat. So what she started to do was she rented a car. She was nothing if she was not intrepid as a woman doing most of this by herself. She had gotten married briefly in order to move out of her parents' house, but she also got divorced very soon after that. And so in the 40s, she rented a car, she hired a driver, and she drove from South Africa to Central Africa and went to what was then known as the Belgian Congo. And she spent time with Black communities there. What's really interesting about this time that I talk a lot about in my book, because it was something that we had talked about in scholarly circles, but I think is really interesting for us to think about, is that Stern shows up to the Belgian Congo. She doesn't know much about it. She starts to observe some more ethnic conflict. So she starts to notice that there are people who are shorter people who are subservient to the taller Africans, and they're having, conflicts. And what she's actually writing about and observing at that time is the conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis that would eventually become the Rwandan genocide in 1994. So many years after she passed away. But again, to have an artist be in this space where she's observing this and painting this and describing this really gives us a lot to think about when we talk about the value of art in thinking through social problems. So Stern did an artist book, which is a beautiful book. It's called Congo. She uses raffia to decorate the book, and you can see this beautiful image from Congo of a Tutsi woman on top of it's a Kuba textile. It's a photograph of a Kuba textile. And so this really helps her to start processing ideas of race. And she did that. She came back to South Africa for a little while. And then in 1948, she actually went to Zanzibar. So same thing, like she got in a car and she drove and she took a boat to Zanzibar, and she started painting images of women in particular, but also Muslim men in Zanzibar. So it's a really interesting period of her work that I think is important as we think about some of these questions. She made the best of a really challenging time. She was not able to go back to Europe, but she was able to have these really enriching travel experiences. So how was she able to do this? When she came back to South Africa in 1948, South Africa codified the laws that became the basis of apartheid. And part of apartheid's success in keeping people separate was by limiting movement and mobility. So white people could no longer go to places where they had gone before, and Black people's movements in white spaces were severely limited. And that included international travel as well. And so Stern, as someone who loved traveling and whose whole life was built on international travel, she needed an exemption if she was going to continue being able to exhibit and show her work. The government had a vested interest in Stern as well, because Stern's paintings showed the diversity of South Africa and of the African continent. Her work was a good cover for them. If someone like Stern, who's a woman, who's a Jewish artist, who's painting these images, could exhibit in other countries, the apartheid government was then able to say, how bad could apartheid be? Look, we have this artist who gets to go and travel and paint all these beautiful images of Black people. It's not as bad as you think. So Stern was given a lot of special dispensation. She was allowed to travel when many people were denied. She was able to go to places that other artists were not able to go. And this is a photograph of Jan Schmutz, who was a prime minister of South Africa, who, despite being a staunch pro-apartheid politician, was also extremely international. So I'm hoping in the discussion we can talk about that paradox as well. You know, all these people who have had so much exposure to other people and cultures, but still have very provincial racial views in particular. So it was through her, she had a relationship, a letter correspondence. She had letters of transit from Jan Schmutz that allowed her into spaces that other people could not. And that is part of the reason why we have a stronger understanding of her work even today, because she was able to do this. She was invited to show in exhibits in places that other Black artists in particular were not able to participate in. She was represented South Africa in the Venice Biennale, in the Sao Paulo Biennale, and other places. And that gave her a level of visibility that others didn't have. So in the early 40s, as I mentioned, it was very difficult for Stern to travel to Europe. She had been to Congo and Zanzibar. She really enjoyed spending time in South Africa painting Black South Africans. She would go to rural areas and she would sit with people. Before apartheid, she was welcomed. She doesn't ever say exactly why she loved going out there, but my working theory is that she was very self-conscious about her personal appearance. She had frizzy hair, she was overweight, she had diabetes that was uncontrolled, and she was judged in Cape Town for her looks. But when she went to these areas, she was welcomed. No one judged her for her size. No one judged her for what her hair looked like. She felt comfortable. And that started to change as apartheid restricted people's movements. So I have these two images up here so you can see some of that evolution that I'm talking about. In 1941, she did this painting called Xhosa Woman, which is, Xhosa is an ethnic group in South Africa, and she painted this woman wearing traditional dress. And then by 1955, she painted one of the only images that she's painted of a woman in a domestic setting, in an urban domestic setting, wearing a domestic's uniform. And I love this painting. I love both of these paintings, but Made in Uniform is one of my favorite paintings because it is unusual for Stern herself. The palette is very different. If you can see the Xhosa woman, there's brighter blues, there's yellow, there's red, there's the white around her eyes. But the maid, there's an obvious change in posture, in mood, in facial expression. And I think that that's very indicative of the time and the condition. You know, South African women, white women, relied heavily on Black women for domestic labor and service. They watched their children, they cooked their meals, they took care of their houses. And they did that usually to the neglect of their own children. And it was very difficult work that was poorly compensated. And you know, Stern, even though she didn't have children, she had friends who had children. Domestics were people who everyone had one in their home. And so this painting, you know, really comes at a time when apartheid and the anti-apartheid resistance were growing. The ANC was very active in protesting apartheid. Women were protesting, Black women were protesting in Pretoria. And so there's a lot of question about, you know, was Stern making political statements in her work? Was she aware of the politics of the time? And I'm arguing that, you know, even if she overtly stated it or not, the act of painting a Black woman in a painting called Made in Uniform in 1955 at the height of the ANC's defiance campaign is a political statement. And, you know, we can talk about what she meant by that statement, but, you know, she's captured this anger and resentment towards the daily indignities that apartheid meted out to individuals. And how devastating it was to the majority of South Africa's population. So, you know, Stern, for the last 10 years of her life, she traveled back and forth to Europe. She really didn't want to spend as much time in South Africa because of what was going on with apartheid, because Africa was decolonizing. She really would prefer to be in Europe, and she was very ill. As I mentioned, she had undiagnosed diabetes or unregulated diabetes, and she would go to Mediterranean places and spend a lot of time convalescing there and painting there. So, you know, she had enjoyed a very successful career. Her paintings sold for lots of money. She had a beautiful house in Cape Town. She was able to travel internationally, and she was just extremely successful. You know, she couldn't overcome these health problems, so she died in 1966 at the age of 71, because she didn't have children, she left her entire estate and her home to the University of Cape Town. And so now it's a museum, and it's been a museum since 1971. So if you ever go to Cape Town, I would highly encourage you to visit the museum. The museum today is designed to showcase her legacy. Her studio is left as it was on the day she died. She had an extensive collection of African art that you can view, and there's gallery space for contemporary artists. But in recent years, there's been a public reckoning in South Africa about Irma Stern and people like Stern, and whether or not they should continue to be the quote unquote face of South African art, particularly since many Black South African artists were not afforded any opportunities to train as artists. Many of them were persecuted, and they were not allowed to have access to the things that Stern had access to. And this debate is in artistic circles, but it's also, you know, a broader discussion about who gets memorialized in South Africa and why. So at the University of Cape Town, which is not far from where Stern lived, there is a very large statue of Cecil John Rhodes, the diamond magnate who created the industry in South Africa and became very wealthy. And a young man named Chumani Maxwele, who you see on my left, he was a student at the University of Cape Town. He lives in one of the townships where there are only shared porta potties and not a lot of access to running water. He got tired of walking past the statue, so he took one of those buckets of excrement and tossed it on the statue. And thus began the Rhodes Must Fall movement that culminated in the removal of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes in 2015. And this is really, this conversation has to me strengthened the South African arts community and just generally enriched the dialogue about South Africa's very fraught political and social history, but it relates to Stern as well. The students protested. They made a series of demands. They asked that artists who had benefited from apartheid have their work be taken down on campus. And so, you know, Stern, given all of the privileges that she enjoyed as a South African artist later in life, is part of that discussion. And so in 2018, I taught a class in South Africa called Monuments, Museums, and Memory in South Africa. I brought students to the Irma Stern Museum. I brought students to meet with Chumani, who was gracious enough to talk through his own social and political activism and to really galvanize the students in thinking about these questions. And now Chumani's actually an advisor to the Irma Stern Museum and helping to redo the collection and reorganize and tell the story of Irma Stern in a different type of context. So despite all of the tension and conflict that's going on in South Africa about these public monuments, there are stories where people are coming together to make social change. So I want to come back to this painting of Men in Uniform and, you know, bring things back to the United States. You know, we're in 2022. We're still in the middle of a raging public health crisis, the COVID-19, but there's another public health crisis that we're aware of and that we need to think more about in our own individual actions in that. And that's, you know, the issue of racism and how it affects people in the Black community. The value of a Black life in America today still bears very eerie parallels to the value of Black life in apartheid era South Africa. And we're surrounded by these images of lives lost, dreams denied, and the structural racism that gets us to police violence. And so we really need to think about why so many people are comfortable with ignoring the ways in which Black people are subjected to this type of racialized subjugation and disenfranchisement and violence. And think about how do these images of Black women in particular confront or confirm our beliefs about what's fair and just and equitable, or humane and morally right in our society? And then what can each of us do to disrupt these troubling thought patterns in our own lives and in our own communities. So, Stern seems like an artist from another era, from another time, from a faraway place, but her personal story as a child of immigrants, being a refugee, being surrounded by Black women, by colored women, by Jewish South Africans, this kind of interaction helped expose apartheid's racist principles. Through her work, she's exposing what's wrong about apartheid, while also giving us a sense of what her life was like as a young artist trying to establish herself in a predominantly male field that was predominantly white, predominantly Christian. So, we all have these social and political contradictions that we live with. I'm not pretending to judge Irma Stern for that. We all have them. But it's important that we pause and we look ahead and think about, what can we do to work on these for ourselves and for our communities. So, Stern's paintings sell for millions of dollars. I wish that I had somehow bought something 20 years ago when I was a poor graduate student, because her work sells for a lot of money. And she's one of the top South African artists at auction. Her work is becoming more known internationally, which is raising the value of the work. And in writing this book, I benefited from access to so many catalogs and articles and research about her, but I was continuously troubled by the fact that I knew that there were Black artists who were working at the same time who didn't have the same kind of recognition and who didn't have the same footprint in the archive. There's just pages and pages and pages of Stern's work in and her materials and her personal effects are in various archives in Cape Town. And I really felt that there was something that I needed to do differently with this book to change that. And so in the last chapter of my book, I decided to interview young Black South African artists who were working right now. And I interviewed 4 of them who were based in Johannesburg, Duduzi Lemore, David Malabane, Tuli Lubisi, and Pule Ratsoma. And these were artists who were influenced by Irma Stern in some way. And I spoke with them about how Stern had influenced them and what their hopes were for the future as artists and for the future of South Africa. So I wanted to end the book on their terms and looking forward. I didn't want to write another book that would just make Stern's paintings worth more and more money. I wanted to write a book that would change the conversation and give other artists an opportunity to talk about their work and their hope for South Africa. So, why an art lecture, at the end of MLK weekend? Art gives us that language. It's an unspoken language of ideas. It gives us a vocabulary for discussing complex thoughts. And this is true for both the artist and the audience. So what we see and what we understand about Black people or Black women in particular from Stern's paintings is very different from her own public positions on race. But the study of art history gives us this framework and context for understanding this historical time period that isn't really so far in the past, and as some would argue, isn't really past. Dr. King wrote frequently about his frustration about the pace of change and the pace of social change. And that's something that I really identify with as an international educator, as a social justice scholar. I want change to happen now because there are things that people are enduring that they should not endure for another minute. But I also know that I'm one person contributing to a movement and that it has a much longer arc. And he wrote in his letter from the Birmingham jail in 1963 about this idea of people telling him and the Black community that they should wait for rights, that they should go slower. And, he says, this wait has almost always meant never. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say wait. So for me, this connects to Stern because, she struggled to gain recognition as a Jewish artist in South Africa. But her legacy and the value of her work has crowded out many of these other artists who are mostly Black and colored in South Africa. And I wrote the final chapter of my book in this way because I didn't want these artists to wait any longer. I felt that it was finally time for them to gain recognition. I encourage you to look into these artists. I can put the link to some of their work in the chat for you. But I think it's really important for me as a scholar to give them the torch and let them take the next chapter of South African art on their own. So I'm going to end this talk with a quote from Richard Feldman, who was Stern's friend, that still resonates with me as I think about the role that art plays in helping us make sense of our world. Feldman said this when he was writing about Irma Stern's paintings of Black people in particular, and the question of whether Jewish art constituted art that should depict Jewish subjects, or if it was art that addressed themes in contemporary society. And he says, quote, "Art cannot be based merely on sentimental idols. It must reflect our life. When our times are stormy, the art of the day reflects the storm. Some succeed to portray the coming calm after the storm, others the peace before, but these are few in number and recognized in their own time," end quote. Thank you so much for listening today.
Thank you, LaNitra. That was really so wonderful and informative. Even I've read most of your book. As you know, I received it this week, and I just, there's so many, let me just, hold on. There are so many questions that we could continue discussing. There are a few that come to my mind, especially given the way in which you bring it together in the last chapter and talking about today and moving forward. But I guess one of the questions that I know has been, there's this controversy about Irma Stern, which is that, certainly her art is incredible. And as you said, still the value of her artwork continues to increase. And there is also this question of her personal conduct in terms of, did she benefit from apartheid, or was she an opportunist, maybe some might say? And how do we balance that in how we look at her, how we recognize the value of what she accessed and what she was able to give light to with her work, and the way in which she was able to get it out there. And I know that question of comparing or contrasting with Rhodes, I'll end there because there's a lot in there, but I think that's a question we struggle with still today in terms of the merit and value of art or writing and the way in which it comes to be shared.
I'm so glad, Rabbi Sue, that you brought this up. And, I'm certainly interested in hearing what other people think about it, because there's so many different viewpoints. But I came into the conversation early on because of my frustration with how we talk about Paul Gauguin, who had painted in the South Pacific and had raped a lot of the women and young girls that he painted. And it fundamentally changed the way I saw his work. And we have this conversation a lot about male artists, but because women are underrepresented, we don't talk about what that means for women to have those same views. For me, it really depends on the day. There's so many different ways that I can connect and identify with Stern's background. Being underrepresented as a woman, as a member of a minoritized community, but she also had opportunities to make different decisions and didn't. Of all of the artists, the South African artists, she was a Jewish South African artist, and Jewish South Africans disproportionately spoke out against apartheid. So she was really much more attuned and had access to information that other people didn't. And, she made the decision to benefit her own career and to be rich and famous. all that being said, she was still surveilled by the apartheid government. She was still criticized at times by the government. So, you know, she wasn't completely feted by them either. So none of these things are straightforward, but I think it's a really important question for us to be asking.
Along those lines, Marty Tillman shared in the chat that your talk has helped him, and certainly me as well, to more fully understand the meaning of the term intersectionality, the complexity of Stern as white, Jewish, and living in a Black society. And I'm wondering, given that, what lessons about Black-Jewish relations did you learn, or would you share as we talk about our reality, as we talk about this weekend in particular, but this weekend as a catalyst and an inspiration for us to move forward together? So how do we bring all of that, and what can we use?
So anti-Semitism and racism are two sides of a very ugly coin. And what I've noticed both in my work in South Africa and here in the United States is that there are many times when people are experiencing racism, and the only people who come to aid as allies are people from the Jewish community. And I think that that's significant, and it's something that we have to continue to nurture. Stern's friendship with Richard Feldman, who was someone who didn't necessarily have to comment on the situation in the mines. You know, he could have benefited himself from economically and not said anything, but he chose to write a book in Yiddish about this and bring this conversation to a specific audience. And I think that the idea that you have to speak out against injustice, even if it's not happening to you, you have to speak out, is something that I saw in the Jewish community in South Africa, that to me really resonated. I came as an American to Cape Town. I didn't know anyone. I was brand new, and you know, my first forays into the Jewish community, I was welcomed, and people shared their stories with me, and they were honest about this very difficult understanding of their own white identity in South Africa during apartheid and how conflicting it was for them. But many of them used that particular privilege when they saw it to advance the cause of racial and social justice. So there are many times when we find ourselves privileged. I find myself privileged a lot of times, and I have to make sure that I say to myself, I'm privileged in this situation. How can I use this privilege to benefit others? Not just myself, but how do I use it to help other people? And that's a question that so many people have answered in the affirmative in ways that have really transformed society. Sometimes at a cost. It's not free to speak up, but you have to do it.
Thank you. As Dr. King famously said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and that importance of our speaking up. So given that, and given what you were sharing a little bit about Irma Stern's background and involvement with the apartheid government, we have a question from one of our participants. Would you want to hang one of her paintings in your home despite her background?
That's a great question. As a matter of fact, my husband spends some of his free time like looking around for affordable Irma Stern works. And he found something at auction a couple of days ago and asked me about it. So the answer is yes. But I tend to put myself in positions where I'm around people who don't always agree with me. So I'm slightly more comfortable with it, because I've sat with this woman for 22 years, and I've come to see the darker sides of her biography that I dislike, but I've also seen through myself and through these other Black artists the things that have inspired and supported other people. And I think that that's what makes her human. And that's what makes her art so interesting. As I mentioned, I don't have any Sterns in my possession at the moment, but I did buy a painting that Tuli Lubisi made for the Turbine Art Fair a few years ago. And that work is hanging right over my desk. And so I look at that work and I see the future of South Africa, but I also see Irma Stern in that work. And I find that to be really inspiring and beautiful. So if I ever had the opportunity, some of her work is just stunning. It's just absolutely stunning. And there are times when I go back and look at work that I haven't seen in a while, and it just takes my breath away. So to have that type of experience in your home on a daily basis, I think is exhilarating. So I would encourage you all to look at her art, but also at the work of these younger Black South African artists as well.
And anyone, whether her art and certainly theirs, gives you that opportunity to share the conversation and have the discussion about these values and what's important. How did you choose? Well, two questions. One is, how did you choose the image for your book, which I know came up a few times in the image for the cover, which I know came up a few times during your talk. And also, I'm curious if you talked about the catalog falling open, and I'm wondering if you remember and know which of her paintings sparked this interest in the first place, just caught your attention.
So it's a very minor Irma Stern work. It was a watercolor of a Black woman. So there was nothing distinctive about it. It was just the beauty of the colors, and the woman's facial expression just was something that looked so familiar to me. And if the work of many of the 20th century white European artists who've never been to Africa, you don't get that same connection with the figures. And so when this fell open, I stopped. I just really saw the humanity in the sitter that I hadn't seen before. And as soon as I saw the painting and realized how extraordinary her life was, I kind of knew I better start getting ready to move to Germany.
Well, we have a word for that, which you and I talked about before we started, which is beschert. Sometimes things happen, books fall open to the right page that catches your eye.
Exactly. Yeah. Like it was, I didn't know it at the time, but it was meant to be. So the cover image is Made in Uniform, which is the painting that I talked about that she did in 1955. That painting is in the Irma Stern Museum. And so that's where I did my field work. When I moved to Cape Town, I got married, and then 9 days later, I left my husband in Washington, D.C., and I moved to Cape Town. And every day I went to the museum, and they were so kind and so welcoming to me there. And that painting was hanging in the museum. So I saw it every day, and I loved the colors, the size. It's a rather large painting. And I just love seeing it every day. But most importantly, what connected me to the painting was the fact that it depicted a woman who was working in domestic service in the 50s. And that's my legacy. That's my grandmother did that kind of work. That was the only work she could get as a Black woman. And so I saw myself, I saw my family heritage in that same history and in that woman's face. Many of my Black women colleagues said, like, how many of us have not been on the receiving end of a look like that before? So it just reminded me of where I came from. And so I felt like I wanted an image like that to be on the cover, because I was talking about so many of these difficult and complicated social issues, as opposed to a lot of books will have some of Stern's still lives or some of the more bucolic setting. I wanted to just dive right into the hard stuff with that cover image.
Thank you. So given when you talk about where you came from and the trajectory of your work, what's the current focus of your work? And will you tell us a little bit about how you bring your artwork into not just your teaching, but how you bring your research into your teaching, and also opportunities in the larger Black and Jewish community.
Wow, that's a great question. So I'm still interested in the intersections of Black and Jewish communities around social activism and art. So I'm currently at the early stages of a new project because I'm still on the book tour for this book. But now I'm interested in how a Black artist in the Harlem Renaissance painted portraits of Jewish Chicagoans. So kind of a flip side. And that artist's name is William Edward Scott. And so I'm in the very early stages of looking at why he painted specific individuals from the Jewish community and on the south side of Chicago. He painted lots of other scenes of Israel, and how these relationships developed, and what kinds of dialogue was going on between him and his sitters. And so that's my next project. I'll see where it goes. It's a lot closer than South Africa, so I'll be able to go back and forth much more frequently. But at the same time, I'm also working more directly with the Black and Jewish communities through my work at the Poses JCC on the board there, but also my direct work with students. This has been a very difficult time on college campuses as the universities have been closed or virtual and students have been disconnected. And yet this has been a tumultuous time socially where students want to be active. They want to explore how to speak up and stand up against social injustice, but some of that has had to occur virtually. So I'm doing a lot of work with Black students and the African American Studies program at Mason in terms of our curriculum. We are forging a stronger alliance with Judaic Studies at Mason and trying to help support and elevate Judaic Studies. We're trying to have very difficult conversations between the two communities about Black Lives Matter and the Israel-Palestine conflict, and really help students to think about what it means to move into communities when they graduate and take these values that they've learned in college and move into communities. The other project that I'm working on is called Black Lives Next Door, which is a student faculty research project that I'm doing with two other history faculty, Ben Carton and George Oberly. And this past summer, we paid students to do archival research on the role of racism and segregation in the early founding years of George Mason University. And that has taken us through some very interesting archival journeys all the way back to the presence of a Rosenwald school near Fairfax campus. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Julius Rosenwald. And so even that has a Jewish connection because this Rosenwald school was established. It closed after segregation ended. And there's not a lot of traces of this history, and it's right next door to George Mason University. And so there was a Black community there that was thriving and that was focused on education, and we want students to understand how their university was founded and what happened to the Black communities that were in the vicinity. So those are just a few of the things that I'm working on right now. And just trying to build coalitions and communities so that people can really build bridges and connect with each other even when they disagree.
And I know you'll be doing that through a class you're going to be teaching. I think it's next semester, maybe, with if you can speak to that too.
Yeah. So in the fall of 2023, which seems so far away right now, I'm teaching a joint class with Lauren Strauss at American University on Black-Jewish relations in America. And it will be a joint class taught by George Mason and American University, open to students in the Washington Consortium. And we're going to be exploring this relationship and talking about it from the perspective of culture, from the perspective of politics. And we'll be visiting museums, we'll be bringing in guest speakers. But you know, it's a real opportunity for students to come together across universities and across different backgrounds and talk about this shared history that has brought us so much joy, so much artistic production, so much political and social change. You know, this is a relationship that is to be celebrated for what it's accomplished.
Well, thank you so much for already what you've shared, but certainly what you're going to continue to do. And we look forward to continuing that journey with you. And so appreciative of your time today. Thank you again for being with us. And a reminder that you can purchase LaNitra's book through the WHC Mitzvah Mall. There's a link on our website, and there was a link in the chat, which hopefully you've all accessed already. And we look forward to continuing the conversation, and so grateful for not only your work, but more importantly, how you bring that into, how you manifest that in the world, not only through your teaching, but through your inspiration as well. So thank you. And thank you to the Jewish Book Council for the partnership on in making this possible. And we're delighted because you're close by. So we hope that the next time we can be in person. And we, again, we're so grateful for you and for this morning. And I want to just remind everyone, we have our Martin Luther King Day of Service tomorrow at Washington Hebrew. Whether you join us in person or not, we just want to wish you all again not only a Happy New Year, but we want to make sure that you continue to stay safe and healthy, and we look forward to hopefully gathering in person before too long. We look forward to the opportunity to be together once more. So thank you, LaNitra, so much.
Thank you, Rabbi Sue. Thank you for the invitation, and thank all of you for coming out to the presentation, especially my dear friends and colleagues who've joined us. I really appreciate it, and having this opportunity to speak about Irma Stern. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day, everybody. Take care. Bye.